Good morning, colleagues. Welcome to our Imagined Geographies Past and Future Symposium. And I would like to welcome all of you in the room who are here with us in Norwich at University of East Anglia, and also to those of you who are online. I think there's quite a number of people who are online today who will be joining us and coming in and out. And do feel free to come in and out throughout the 2 days of the symposium. We're delighted to have so many of you here involved with us thinking about the future and the past. And this is particularly important for us from the point of view of the New Area Studies Research Centre at the University of East Anglia. This is an innovative event bringing together researchers from our new research centre on area studies, from the East Centre in history at University of East Anglia and the School of Global Development at the university. And this is the first time that we have run an event together. When we did our call for papers for this Imagined Geographies theme, we were inundated with 130 abstracts. And my colleagues, Francis King and Maria Arbranch, were amazed by what arrived in our inboxes. If we had just done what we intended to do at the beginning, which was a small symposium, we could only have accommodated 24 papers. But with so many excellent ideas, we decided that what we would do would be to split them up and run 3 seminars or 3 symposiums throughout the course of this academic year. So this one that we're running today and tomorrow on area studies generally is the first of the 3 events. And then we will be running 2 others later in the year, one on Eastern Europe in February, which Francis will be running, and one in May, which Maria will be running on the Global South. We intend to publish a selection of papers from these 3 events in our online journal, our open access journal, which is called New Area Studies. I hope you've all managed, just Google it and it will come up. I hope you've all managed to see it. And also, just while we're literally online, I'm just going to say we have a call for papers for a 5th anniversary of that journal, which will be feedback. I'm going to have to ask the tech helpers to try and sort out the feedback. A 5th anniversary of the journal, which will be for next year. And if any of you are interested in contributing to that, we'd be delighted to hear from you. There are a number of people I want to thank who have helped organise this seminar. Francis Maria, obviously, our former Pro-Vice Chancellor Sarah Barrow, Tracy Gaskin, and Tom Smith, who has been stellar, who is the Deputy Director for Area Studies here and who's trying to sort out the tech at the moment, and Richard Delahey, who is our administrator, who's somewhere else trying to sort out the tech. So anyway, we hope that it will work as we go through the 2 days. And of course, I want to thank all of our myriad presenters today and our excellent keynote speaker, Professor Edith Klaus from the University of Virginia. So without more ado, I'd like to introduce our new Pro-Vice Chancellor for the Faculty of Arts and Humanities, Professor Catherine Richardson, and to thank her very much for giving us her time today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My job is to welcome you here, which is rather ironic because this is my 4th week in the role. So many of you, most of you probably in this room, with the exception of our keynote speaker, know more about area studies at the University of East Anglia than I do. But I'm very delighted to be here and to be learning more about it myself. I think it's an incredible area of work, and what I've been told so far has been truly inspiring. So it's very exciting to open this, as we've heard, the first of 3 Imagined Geographies symposiums to be held at UEA this year, and to have it as a collaborative piece of work between the centres, the 3 research centres that you've heard about, and the School of Global Development. And this event then is led by the New Area Studies Research Centre, and over recent years the growth of area studies research at UEA has been remarkable, From REF 2014 to REF 2021. And for those of you from other countries, this is the rather peculiar process by which the UK government measures our research. But between those two dates, the number of colleagues returned in area studies grew some 220, nearly 30%, which I think is testament to the way in which it speaks to colleagues from across the university and allows people to see their research outside disciplinary specialisms. The results in 2021 were excellent. UEA was ranked 5th nationally, recognising that national and international standing. And it should be said that UEA was scored higher than both Oxford and Cambridge and many of the Russell Group institutions in the UK. And that's a pretty incredible, wonderful result, but perhaps not terribly surprising, given how universities like UEA specialise in this kind of multidisciplinary, really cutting edge, exciting new ways of imagining research. UEA has been at the forefront of the recent revival of the field, pushing boundaries in theory, in publications, as you've been hearing, and in agenda setting colloquia, impact case studies, the creation of the open access journal, new area studies, as well as a book series, new area studies for Routledge. I'm trying to move so that I don't make that happen. Perhaps I'd be better off just shouting, in fact. I hope people online can hear. It's really, really exciting to see this new field developing, or this field going in a new direction, because colleagues in area studies are drawn from across arts and humanities and social science, coming from politics, philosophy and area studies, media, language and communications, history and art history, literature, drama and creative writing, the Sainsbury Research Unit, which, if people don't know it and are able, either physically or online, you should perambulate around it. It's quite incredible. And from global development. And there are wider ambitions to create new areas of exploration, including in health and well-being. And I think that different way of looking at how we address the crucial and intractable problems of our modern world, which this week, as we were saying earlier, are particularly intense, is really vital, bringing together different types of skill and analysis. So big interdisciplinary and boundary crossing ambitions. And there's some wonderful publications coming out along these lines. Susan Hodgett's book, 2021 book with Rod Rhodes, interested in blurring genres between arts and humanities and social science to create those new insights that we desperately need at the moment. So that work is directly improving lives in Latin America, in education, health, women's leadership, cultural memory, archaeological skills and ecotourism. In North America, there are new insights into unknown, underappreciated histories of Indigenous people, comparative literatures, including the role of circus, I'm told, about which I would like to hear more, and arts poetry in the work of Black female academics. And as our first panel today illustrates, we are reimagining the future of new area studies in the context of American studies. And I think it's really interesting to see that transition, that different way of thinking about American studies in terms of area studies. In the UK, we've led innovations on translation and philosophy in area studies and the novel, and created new theories and methods, bringing visual graphics into theory on political studies and international relations, for instance. We've contributed to new policy in Parliament on early and forced marriages, and have impacted British maritime history through incredible prize-winning discoveries in our Gloucester project about a remarkable royal wreck just off the coast of East Anglia, shaping future contributions to local and national museum collections and understanding that event of the wreck and its recovery in a local, national and international context. Our humanities faculty is conducting outstanding work in making life better for people across the world and across time. And I'm starting to learn about the depth and breadth of that work. The Open Access Journal has been incredibly influential with many views online. And there is a YouTube channel on the East Centre and Global Development webs. Please, I will go back and have a proper look at it myself. Do have a look at that. So we're thrilled to be working together in this global context as we go forwards, leading the discipline into the third wave of area studies. I'm really delighted to welcome you to this first symposium on Imagined Geographies, a unique event bringing together these different areas of work at UEA and beyond. So welcome.
Over the mic for a bit.
Well away from anything that's like technical advice. I'm Rachael Mclennan. I'm head of school for politics, philosophy, and area studies. And I'm going to share the first session that we have today. I may know you up and down. I'll just see how things go. First off, I noticed that Susan has characteristic on state out to everybody except herself. So I think we need a big recognition of all the work that Susan has done to make this symposium come into being. And hopefully we'll have many more moments throughout the next couple of days where we get to thank Susan as well. But it's true, it's been a real group effort as well. Lots of people working very hard to make this. From my perspective as head of school, I'm really excited to be starting the event with a panel that looks at work being done in the School of PPA, which, as those of you internally in UEA will know, came into being about a month, 6 weeks ago, something along those lines. So again, the timing of the symposium is lovely, coinciding with the school as well. So yeah, the title of this panel then is The Infinite Space of Imagined Geographies, American Studies in the Age of New Area Studies. The papers in this panel are emerging from a co-authored book. The title is the panel title, pretty much. And just to give you a sense of some of the kind of animating questions that that book is considering, we are putting into conversation American studies and area studies, thinking about how do we study America today? What does American studies contribute to new area studies? What does the emergence of new area studies help contribute to our understanding of America? So without much further ado, we'll go on to our first speaker, who is Sarah Garland, who is Associate Professor in Literature and Visual Culture, Area Studies, and the title of her paper is Area Aesthetics and Atmosphere, New Area Studies and Everyday Creativity. And just a quick administrative point, we'll hear all the papers in succession and then we'll have a moment for discussion at the end.
Thank you. I'm guessing I'm better here, slightly away from the microphone. Yeah.
I'll turn it down, I think.
Fantastic. The specific brand of everyday creativity, everyday activity I'd like to talk to you about under cover of creativity in general is dress. So a new one for area studies, I think, and thank you for the time to unfold it here. So what I'm about to outline for you comes in part from a large research project that attempts to use the language and the idea of area and atmosphere to investigate everyday practices and specifically everyday creativity through dress. The monograph project I'm working on at the moment foregrounds women's normative dress in the West, cisgender, able-bodied, because that's where the biggest environmental problems are coming from. But the smaller essay for this area studies collection that Rachael kindly introduced for us drills down into the history of casual wear as part of that. So you will see fragments of this in this paper too. Where I started in both cases was in a complex moment in a specific place, that moment of choice that we might have in front of a wardrobe or a chair or the pile on the floor that encapsulates these decisions we might make about dress every day. And I begin to think through what kinds of conceptions of area we would need to cope with this very small but complex moment in place. It's a moment that's to do with perhaps predicting the tone of the room you might walk into later on that day. It's perhaps to do with predicting the weather, predicting how you might move, how the fabrics you're wearing might move, predicting a sort of almost back and forth that you might have using this incredibly complex blend of embodied practice, aesthetic judgment, imagination, creativity, perhaps anxiety and rebellion too. Perhaps you're deciding not to care about this. Right? Awful lot of anxiety in dress studies, interesting. So can we have an area studies that works with this kind of tiny, personal, but consequential version of place? And what might this theory look like? So the research prompts for the larger monograph project, in case you are excited by frocks, are here. But which I'll not go into now, but happy to talk to you about in the questions. The important part is that it's an attempt to think through how area studies can include embodied and material practices. Or to flip it, thinking through how to include the notion of area as it feeds the personal, the material of dress, and the everyday. So moving from this idea of area as a macro, state level, border level thing, down into the smallness of the everyday. How do we make those two speak to each other? The most useful idea I've been able to borrow for this project so far has been about atmosphere, which I think is an idea that's made its way around human geography and anthropology. So I first came across it in Tim Ingold's work, a little bit in philosophy too, but it's not really something that I've seen much outside of there. An atmosphere is what you might imagine it to be from the vernacular use of the word. It's a mood or a tone or a feeling in place. The first major theorist of this, in this form at least, is a German eco-philosopher and phenomenologist, Garland, who talks about the aesthetics of atmospheres. And he talks about atmospheres as a relationship between environmental qualities and human states, and begins to try and work out how this feeds into the idea of an everyday aesthetic that you both sense but take part in producing as well. And this is the pivot I think is useful for an understanding of this smallness of area. If we can have a language that mediates between paying attention to the environment, whether it's a room or a city or a street in place, and the human state which draws from it but also feeds into it, we begin to get a language for talking about the ways the small and the local as points of complexity can be part of what's studied when we study area. And we might also have the beginnings of a language for how one might think about acting in place. So my case study about dress becomes part of an atmosphere, and dress might be part of what you're deciding is not sending a message about identity as much as trying to work out a mood which is fearful or cozy or powerful or energized. So much more to do with the back and forth between the person and the place the person's in, rather than this old-fashioned idea that you get in older dress studies, which is I transmit my identity to you. My problem with that is the clothes get in the way, right? It's not they transmit, it's actually they get in the way. We'll talk about that after if you like. So my case study for the edited collection is on casual wear, the American look, and the evolution of this unmarked mode of dress. I won't go into a lot of it here, but this is what's coming. But what I'm thinking might be useful in this forum is to move sideways a little and go into the theory behind reading area as and through these more intimate deliberations. We have so much fantastic work on what an area means at a macro level on borders and nation states and movements, but actually we don't have much theory on the idea of area as not just the local, but something as small as the hyperlocal or the body field. What does it mean to think those fields in place? What does it mean to dwell within an area when we feel and intervene in an area that varies incredibly from space to space? So the other task of the area studies book, Infinite Space it's currently called, Rachael gestured to, is to ask the question about what kinds of practice and thought these type of interdisciplinary studies might bring to the field of new area studies as a whole. So alongside that and informed by that, and as part of a back and forth of that, I've been thinking through in good dressmaker style from the inside out, what interdisciplinary arts and humanities methodologies in particular might bring to the study of place. And this is very much from where I'm sitting. I'm aware that we have a very, very broad church. So this is incredibly situated, but hopefully useful. So I'm going to take a quick tour through three main areas that might be useful prompts or hypotheses about what happens in that sort of corner, of the Venn diagram. So we have arts and humanities methods. What do arts and humanities methods look like when they function within area studies and as part of this conversation? What do they look like when you put them next to empirical methods? The second one is subjectivity. What might the arts and humanities study of and as subjectivity contribute to the understanding of an area? So again, back to that dialogue between the big and the small, the person and the place. And the last one, scale, right? So as I hope to suggest, there are changes in scales, there are changes in the ways that time and place work if you begin to take these methods seriously. And hopefully some of those changes can become affordances for area studies. So the first thing we've got in this approach to arts and humanities methods is that they're kaleidoscopic, and that's to reprise a word from a wonderful paper that Vincent Uben gave us earlier this year in an earlier symposium. So this means that you don't have an arts and humanities method, you have arts and humanities methods, and each interdisciplinary researcher or team has different versions, signature methods, and I'm thinking of Hilary's work on signature pedagogies as well. The different approaches, different frames, different ways into time and space and subjectivity. So this is me owning my own background, but actually what's important is not so much that particular blend, is that maybe it's not shared so much, right? Maybe there aren't that many people in this room that do this. But in the background of this, there is a larger synthetic logic at work in new area studies. If you ask what happens if you put diverse things like this into dialogue, and if you ask what they have in common, what's different to each other, and you begin to come up with a version of doing area studies which can make room for associative, connective, interpretive, and relational knowledge. So arts and humanities methods and some of the so-called softer sciences ask what it means to put one thing next to another. How does it feel? What are the connections? What are the likenesses? What are the differences? What might it mean to do this thing here, at this time, or 100 years ago, or in America, or in the west of Africa, or 1,000 miles away? This doesn't mean that arts and humanities aren't forensically careful with their text, their data, their inferences, but there's a set of permissions, a mandate even, to see and to seek connection and interpretation in order to solve problems or understand more deeply, and to do this in the face of what's often incomplete or ambiguous or polyvalent data. So they're a really useful mode of solving problems when your data doesn't make as much sense as perhaps you would hope it to. Hope for it. Arts and humanities have got you there. Another things that arts and humanities methods assume, which can extend the study and the idea of area, is that form and material always matter. So you can't just extrapolate content and use it as data. Form and material always matter. The ways we speak about place, the tools we use, the ways we write them, draw them, dwell in them, undertake everyday practices in them, feel creative, feel uninspired perhaps. This matters, and it matters how we create form out of ideas and beliefs. The forms we study aren't just representations of something, they are things. They're training us in different ways of knowing and knowing in place, and they're training us in different epistemologies. And this, again, is part of what arts and humanities methods can bring to area studies. We've got this incredible kaleidoscope of epistemologies that you can begin to draw on. Next thing is for arts and humanities practitioners, subjectivity matters. So that actually where a person is and what it feels to be there is part of how to understand being human in place, alongside physical objects, frequently scarce ones, and other life forms. And if subjectivity matters, then empathy matters. Stories matter, testimonies matter, mythologies matter, imaginaries matter, moods and emotions matter, and particularly the stories and perspectives of others. A humble attention to the wider world Mary Oliver calls the family of things. And if this attentive subjectivity matters, you've also, I'd argue, got a mode of knowledge that can deal with provisionality, with fault and error and conjecture, with the vaguenesses of being a person in a place. It can also deal with and suggest imaginative hypotheses. So it's got a little bit more license to propose what happens next or what could propose. that can roll out suggestions for the future and hold them as lightly or as tightly as the situation might warrant. It has this flexibility built into it. And you have a form of thinking here that can be quite bold when it comes to addressing big questions like sustainability or human motivation or conceptions of beauty or utility or creativity, and the tangled mess that is the supply chain for the global garment industry. And if you put these types of knowledge alongside the insights of researchers doing empirical work in the social sciences and actually in the hard sciences, you have a really advanced set of speculative analytical techniques, which I think is what you hope for from area studies, is kind of dialogue to solve these incredibly complex problems with as much felicity as you can possibly bring. And the fourth thing, which is very exciting, I hope, that comes out of this works the other way. So if you begin with things like stories, testimonies, imaginaries, moods, emotions, histories, metaphors, they do something very exciting and interesting to the ideas of space and time, which means that I'd argue you end up remaking the idea of area from the inside. And one of the ways to describe what a connective, relational, interpretive version of knowledge does with time might be that it begins to fold it. Back to textiles. It begins to produce juxtapositions, to produce jumps, to produce ways of knowing that are outside the linear line of cause and effect, but can still refer to them, that can still measure themselves. It also does the same with space. It allows you through memory to superimpose places, to sit in one place and to imagine other places that it's connected to through material resources, through language. It allows you to go there and to begin to start these dialogues, begin to start these complexities. So you begin to get a sense of an area that's something that's incredibly densely textured, that's producing this complex, nuanced, folded knowledge that always is making and unmaking itself, and that's present in the smallest moments of study. And the reason you have a quote here from Nabokov is because this is one of these kind of wonderful flies in the ointment. Nabokov keeps bothering me in the context of area studies, but in a good way. And this particular part of his autobiography, Speak Memory, he says, "I do not believe in time." There's a provocation. "I like to fold my magic carpet after use in such a way as to superimpose one part of the pattern on another." So Nabokov talks about time here, but in another place in the same autobiography, he talks about a feeling of shuttling through space as well. So he picks up the phone in his study in Switzerland and is imaginatively transported back to his childhood home in St. Petersburg years earlier, and he imagines a long dead manservant picking up the phone. And of course, all of this is rewritten by Nabokov years later in America as he works in Cornell in English. So the whole book works with this incredible sense of movement through metaphor, through space, time, image. This notion of any moment can be infinitely complex. So in this mode, what area might actually be is trying one thought pattern after another, putting a region, a country, a street, a house, one idea next to another, in order to think in a nuanced way about the ways in which ideas move between those folded areas. So perhaps once you start having this idea of this very, very small way of treating area, you get something that looks to me a little bit like a micro area. And this is an idea I've been thinking through. It's my last idea for you, I hope. I've been using the idea of dress studies to test out this idea of a micro area as a locus for layered and folded narratives, which allow you to listen to both human perspectives, but also to consider how area becomes embodied through dwelling in place, in a material world, and with materials. And learning from dress studies, I think, is particularly important here because there are very, very good reasons in a globalized world where we actually need to start thinking about area as folded, I'd argued, as layered, as brought together in moments. And that's because it allows us to work with material meanings and material histories, as well as the ways in which everyday clothing allows us to externalize feelings, ideas, and desires. So if you start thinking about the idea of a micro area as incredibly densely layered, you get room for different times and spaces. You get to move between the historical, the cultural, the personal. But you also get to think about how this becomes embodied as part of atmospheres, part of moods, part of localities. And you begin to have to start considering the material background. So obviously, I'm an associate professor in literature and visual culture. Literature gives me the text, but what's always been a prompt to add back in again is this sense of the material, these things we live in, and these things we live with are not irrelevant. So if you start layering the area materiality back into the area, you, in the case of dress studies, you get the makers, fibres, farmers, weavers, growers, dyers, designers, exporters, and the damage that a lot of this does. And obviously, what this also does, it begins to prompt us to think you cannot possibly study dress in the West without studying who makes that dress and where it goes to, and where it goes from, where it goes to when it finishes our lives. So you begin to get this sense of area absolutely needing to be layered, needing to be something else beyond these national boundaries, as well as the conversation with the kind of boundaries that the laws that dictate these things. So the last prompt I have for this, and I say this is still work in progress, is a practical application of this sense of what a complex moment might mean for area studies. And that's the kind of work you see from this group, which is Fashion Revolution. So each year, Fashion Revolution, every year on the anniversary week of the Rana Plaza disaster, the factory that collapsed in Bangladesh, killing over 1,334 people and injuring 2,500, running in, and those incredible numbers, right? You know, the fact that those numbers can disappear so quickly tells you something about this. Run an incredible international campaign to ask people who made your clothes. So to unpack that tiny moment that you might even perhaps go through unthinkingly each day, to begin to unlock those complex moments, to start reinstating relationality in a complex global world. Because if you start thinking again about the embodied, the in-place moment of getting dressed in its true complexity, and you start thinking about where the fibers in your clothes come from, who made them, who got paid, who didn't get paid to make them, who was growing them, where those items will end up, who ends up having to deal with and pay for climate catastrophe, it's really hard, I think, to go back to an older boundaried sense of area and nation. We need a new philosophical, theoretical sense of area to cope with those problems, I think. And my hope is that the arts and humanities can feed into that. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Sorry, I just very annoyingly passed Rachel a piece of paper saying, "Oh, I changed my title since the the program went out." So yeah, thanks Tom and Susan for this invitation. Thank you, Sarah, for framing the work that we do so beautifully. There are a number of ways in which I hope that this paper speaks to some of the methodologies that Sarah's just laid out for us. I think, like all of the papers on this panel, this paper comes from the longer chapter for the New Area Studies book that we're putting together, and it relates to much larger project I've been working on for a long time now, which looks at the way in which Indigenous Australian women artists, so Black women artists, but that's Black with a K, not without the C, Black women artists in Australia respond to and draw upon images and iconography that come out of anti-Black racism in America and resistance to anti-Black racism in America. And it has its origins in Professor Becky Fraser's wonderful AHRC network on Black female intellectuals. And that network really helped me think about the ways in which how do Black women who are not obviously part of an African diasporic network of Black intellectuals, how do we ensure that they're part of the conversation, and how actually are they doing that work very effectively themselves and drawing those connections themselves. So this paper looks at Indigenous Australian artist Fiona Foley and the way in which she draws on those African American images to draw attention to Australian history. Okay, so in heralding the new area studies in 2018, and in response to ongoing conversations within and critiques of area studies as a discipline, that as scholars such as Michael Hutt have put it, fragment and fracture what should be a global conversation, Susan Hodgett and Patrick James drew attention to the need to integrate the local with the global. That is, to continue area studies' close attention to place and region, but in a way that resists parochialism and bears witness to the ways in which contemporary identities in place are always already formed by transnationally communicated currents of shared history, affect, and activism. The work of Australian artist Fiona Foley is a salient example of the imbrication of local and global histories and how they've shaped her art and her activism. A Bachelor woman from Kagari, also known as Fraser Island, which is on the mid-east coast of Australia, her work is deeply rooted in place. And indeed, many of her best-known works are site-specific. One such example, Courting Blackness, was a 2014 collaborative installation that took over the Great Court of the University of Queensland. Describing herself as an educator as much, if not more, than an artist, Foley is a trenchant critic of the colonial neoliberal university. This exhibition drew attention to universities as troubled and troubling sites of the collection and curation of knowledge about Indigenous people, including the curation and display of their artefacts, and indeed of their very bodies in natural history and anatomical museums. When I talked with Foley for the longer version of this paper, which will appear in the forthcoming New Area Studies book, she explained her motivations for creating art in this way. I think it's all about provoking people to think at a deeper level. That's why I do the work, to provoke people to think and to try to have a different type of dialogue than the dominant narrative. It's always to burst people's bubbles with another truth they may have never encountered before. So it's about intellectually engaging with people too, really, in part to educate themselves about what's taken place before. And what I haven't included there is that she actually goes on to say, so you shouldn't listen to your lecturers, you should go out and kind of do the work yourself. And I'll think of a way to work that into the chapter, but left it out for now. So one way that Foley instigates a different type of dialogue is through the creation of what she terms a visual language, much of which is rooted in her careful excavation and revivification of a bachelor past. As she has explained to Louise Martin-Chu, her biographer, she wanted to represent her Aboriginal heritage visually, but was without symbols. Given the disruption to bachelor culture, traditional skills and iconography had been lost. Her parents told her you have to be true to your culture, and she had a realization. I started to understand that I have remnants of a traditional culture, some of which is in museum collections. That was my traditional culture and I could draw upon it. It felt like a huge jigsaw puzzle. And she found herself with company on this journey. At that time, artists on the East Coast were creating a new visual language, and I became part of that. While her explorations of bachelor resistance to settler violence and European exploitation of people and land on and around Kagari are of course relevant to American Studies' transnational project of exploring the implication of the Americas in global networks of colonialism and its aftershocks, the series of photographs arising from her residency at the International Studio and Curatorial Program in New York have particular significance for scholars of American Studies in the explicit connection that they draw between anti-Black racist violence in the US and Australia and Black resistance to it. This paper therefore focuses on a single photograph, and I think this is in keeping with Sarah's reference to arts and humanities methodologies. This paper is very much a close reading of this photograph. So this paper focuses closely on a single photograph from Foley's 2004 exhibition, Bring It On, aka the HHH, which was created and first displayed at the ISCP in Brooklyn, New York. I read the image closely with reference to Alison Kinney's recent book on the significance and resonance of the hood in American culture, both past and present, to consider some of the ways in which a transnational American studies methodology, informed by literary and cultural studies and firmly rooted in historical awareness, enables a rich translation of Fiona Foley's visual language. I argue here that her work, which subverts highly recognizable tropes of white supremacy, nevertheless performs what Kinney calls the duality of the hood, its signification of both perpetration and victimhood. And in this idea of duality, and again in the longer piece, I put Foley in conversation with writers like Toni Morrison and Saidiya Hartman, who consider kind of Black hauntology and the afterlives of enslavement and the kind of the way that, again, anti-Black racist practices kind of haunt contemporary Black populations. The title of the exhibition, Bring It On, sets the scene for the image, which depicts 7 individuals dressed in robes in the style of the Ku Klux Klan, but which are made out of fabrics that vividly evoke a multifaceted African diaspora. The figures stare calmly at the camera, unapologetic and defiant. The text alongside her photographs tell us that these figures are members of the HHH, the hedonistic honky haters. Appropriately enough, given its transnational reach, Foley was inspired to create the series on the aeroplane while flying from Australia to New York. So if you think of if academics kind of fly by the seat of their pants, literally came up with the idea for this on her way to the residency. So she was flying over to New York for the residency. The idea came while I was flying across. Oh, no, sorry, wrong slide. I picked up an international sort of like Time magazine, and it was a review of a show called Only Skin Deep. And there was an image of an actual Ku Klux Klan member. It was sort of like partial, and you could just see one eye. And I thought, that looks like a woman. It doesn't look like a man. And for me, that was quite powerful because it meant that children are indoctrinated from a very young age. And the photo in question is Andres Serrano's very famous photo entitled Klanswoman. And again, I want to think about those two in relation to one another in the longer version. So describing her collaboration with African-American costume designer Ramona Ponce, and Ponce is actually quite a well-known costume designer, and she was the one that worked with Foley to put together these robes. Foley notes, she measured how far your eyes were apart and the circumference of your forehead, because a part of that cone will sit on your forehead. It's quite snug, and then the eyes are measured, and man, that reality sunk in that all these costumes, actual KKK costumes, are measured to each individual. She goes on to explain that when she later saw the film Django Unchained, there's a scene where they're riding on horseback, and their white hoods are flapping around sort of back to front. And the guy goes, my wife spent a lot of time sewing these, and I was the only person in the audience who laughed out loud because I understood that they're all measured to fit each individual. Foley's doubling down on individual responsibility here challenges the anonymity afforded by the organised and collective racism of the Klan. As Alison Kinney, author of Hood, describes it, executioners, inquisitors, torturers, judges and Klansmen wear hoods as an expression of power, whether they act inside or outside the confines of legal violence. The anonymity of the hoods benefits them to exalt, protect and collectivise their purposes. We may not be able to see their faces, but each Klan member is, of course, an individual with a family and a community who has made a choice to don the robe. While it's not immediately obvious when looking at the HHA photograph itself, as Foley unfolded to me the story of how the series came to be, it became clear that domesticity and white womanhood are in her critical sites as evidence of what we might call the banality of white supremacy. As Judith Butler summarises Arendt's famous concept, so if a crime against humanity had become in some sense banal, it was precisely because it was committed in a daily way, systematically, without being adequately named and opposed. In drawing attention to the imbrication of the Klan with domestic life, Foley implicates not only those who wore the hood and robe, but those who in some cases will have painstakingly measured and sewed each garment in its particularity. D.W. Griffith, the architect of the modern iconography of the Klan, claims to have been inspired by his mother sewing the costume for his father. And while it's well documented that robes soon became available on mail order, there is a pervasive cultural narrative established by Griffith around this idea of the wife and mother as seamstress. And again, I think this is ways in which Sarah's work is so important in framing the work that I'm doing here in terms of that, again, that notion of the everyday and also the implication of white womanhood in these racist practices. Okay, Foley has noted that for many Black viewers, the photographs elicit laughter due to the way that the Klan is burlesqued in the images. But of white viewers, she says, it makes many of them uncomfortable. She goes on, I asked myself, what if the tables were turned? I wanted to provoke a conversation about racism. The HHH subvert the dehumanising gaze of white supremacy. The solidarity and power projected by the group subjects resist the Klan's performative mob-based violence, but also potentially turn the threat towards the perpetrator. Foley thus not only draws on visual imagery easily recognisable from American history and popular culture in order to make the point about the structural similarities between anti-Black racism in Australia and the US, but also insists on the viewer's own implication in the spectacle on display. But even as these images are carnivalesque, turning white supremacy on its head, the fabrics deployed materialise what Kinney has called the duality of the hood. And I want to focus here on African wealth and dignity and enslavement as these kind of two sides of the hood. Okay, on the one hand, the fabrics Foley chose vividly evoke a multifaceted African diaspora, From the names of African nations spiraling around the blue fabric. So this one on the far left here says Africa, 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 kind of down on the vertical. And then the spirals are all names of African nations. So we have Ethiopia, Somalia, Djibouti, Kenya, sort of around in the spirals. From the names of African nations to the use of what appears to be kente cloth for 2 of the tunics and for the belt on the robes. And this is a kind of very important Ghanaian Asante fabric that speaks to very specific things in African culture and African American culture, which again, I don't have time to go into here. But it's often associated with royalty and certainly with pride in culture. So the fabric pattern with masks is reminiscent of Benin bronzes, or perhaps even Man Ray's famous image Noir et Blanc, which featured Kiki de Montparnasse in juxtaposition with an oval ball-style mask, what Henry Louis Gates has called the cubist mask of modernism covering a black Bantu face. Perhaps even more radically, they evoke West African wealth in their golden details and signify the unrepentant decadence of these hedonistic honky haters. On the other hand, the spirals of cowrie shells, and this is on this red robe here, on the red robe have a host of symbolic meanings. As historian Karen Pulliver notes, they are a quintessential example of a commodity currency with not only economic but ritual and social uses. So these cowrie shells similarly signify wealth, but significantly, they are also the shell money of the transatlantic slave trade. Alauda Equiano, whose narrative is now canonical in literary and American studies pedagogy of the transatlantic slave trade, was first enslaved in West Africa for the price of 172 little white shells the size of a fingernail. Similarly, the wax pattern here that reproduces the links of a chain demonstrate the ways in which the hood is a signifier of terror for both the terrorizer and terrorized. This duality is built into Foley's images in the way that HHH stands not just for hedonistic honky haters, but a host of more ambivalent terms. The catalogue for the exhibition includes a list of the H word, which ranges from humble, humiliated, and hostile to hip-hop, horny, and Harlem. For Kinney, the black hood equally signifies victimhood, especially in the climate of Abu Ghraib, the news of which would break within months of Foley's New York City residency. Kinney writes, US forces regularly strip, shackle, and hood prisoners with smothering black cloth hoods. Guantanamo interrogators find that hooding will isolate prisoners and increase feelings of futility. At Abu Ghraib, the hood tortured, shamed, concealed, and disappeared prisoners. Later, it helped shield the perpetrators and policymakers on the scene and at the Justice Department. Hooding and outrage over the hooding served as a cloak, behind which systems of massive state violence remain intact. In staring back from their black hoods, however, the members of the HHH become something more than spectral. They are the shamed, the tortured, and the disappeared, the victims of lynching, of disavowed colonial massacres, of state-sanctioned brute force, but they have returned to enact a reckoning.
Hi, everyone. I'll start with a quotation from H.G. Wells's novel Kips from 1905. And in this scene, the eponymous hero has just dropped a coin into a new music-making machine. So like a kind of proto-jukebox, if you will. And this is what comes out of it. In a sense, you might say America comes out of it. It made sounds like shunting trains. It did not so much begin as blow up your counterscarp and rush forward to storm under cover of melodious shrapnel. It had not so much an air as a ricochet. The music had, in short, the inimitable quality of Sousa. Native American music full of Native American notes, full of the spirit of Western college yells and election howls. Joyous, exorbitant music from the gigantic nursery of the future, bearing the hearer along upon its torrential succession of sounds as if he was in a cask on Niagara. Woo, yah, have at you, the strenuous life, yah, stop, a reprieve, no, bang, bump. So, in this moment, Kipps hears what he knows to be music that sounds like John Philip Sousa's American marches, which were all the rage in England in the early 20th century. Sousa came over in 1901 and attracted enormous crowds. And within that brief snatch of music from the harmonium machine, he immediately is transported to an imagined America with a whole host of associations. And he was certainly not the only one. And Sousa was not the only American music that proved transportative to millions of British listeners in the late years of the 19th century. But this is something that has not been hugely looked at, despite people nudging significant histories of British music, nudging people towards thinking about the American presence in Britain in this period. So Steve Roud, the American influence at all levels cannot be overestimated. Pete Martin and Tia Denora. There is much more work to be done on the impact in the early years of the 20th century of new sounds from America. Despite that, not many people have thought much about this particular period of American musical culture existing within Britain. I'm thinking particularly of the years from about 1860 to the turn of the century. And yet this also feels like a very significant subject for area studies to contemplate, and certainly area studies has contemplated in many ways. If we think about the relationship between music and area, we can see that there are many ways in which music as a popular cultural form can take us to places and do things that maybe other cultural forms can't. So Ray Hudson's comment that both historically and contemporarily there is ample evidence to support the proposition that music has the ability to conjure up powerful images of place, feelings of deep attachment to place. Patricia Pye, who's coming from literary studies here, notes the intrinsic depth of sound impressions offers the aesthetic potential, suggest feelings of being there, which of course is a key concern for new area studies, a sense of temporal spatial reality which eludes visual impressions alone. And as Jim Sykes and Julia Bile have noted, that music can both constitute and cross communal boundaries, and therefore scholars must attend to how instruments, people, genres, idea and sounds move and are listened to, adopted and or resignified. So music can talk about place, but more than that, I think, is what I'm interested in thinking about here is how music can move from one place to another and indeed evoke ideas of place to which listeners have never been and probably will never go, to create an imagined idea of, in this case, America within 19th century Britain. So that, I guess, is the key question here. What imagined geographies were created by American music in late 19th century Britain? So what I will do in the next 15 minutes, hopefully, is take us on a whistle-stop tour of the imagined map of America that was conjured up by only three musical acts which appeared in Britain in the late 19th century. And as I said, there are many more we could pick on, but these traverse the American map rather neatly. So Father Kemp's Old Folks and their projection of a New England village, Buffalo Bill's Wild West show and the sounds of the frontier, and the banjo craze that surrounded the Bowie brothers, who we have just seen on the previous slide. So we'll start with the example of Father Kemp and his Old Folks. You can see Father Kemp on the left there, dressed eccentrically, but as we'll see, that was part of the appeal of what was going on in Father Kemp's Old Folk shows. So Father Kemp was a shoemaker from Reading, Connecticut, which he described as a model New England town where the inhabitants are social, intelligent, and hospitable. And in a sense, what he and his fellow performers did was try to render that model New England town through music on the stage. So beginning from the mid-1850s, Kemp and some of his fellow inhabitants of Reading, Connecticut began to take part in a revival of the good music of former times, which you can see my slide has gone slightly wonky there, but nonetheless was a combination of sacred music and popular songs and revolutionary anthems. So music which would have been popular a couple of generations before they took to the stage. And as well as reviving the musical forms themselves, they also, so we're back to clothing again, they also traveled the wardrobes of New England and dug out what were described as queer, quaint and curious costumes of former times. And this actually went a bit further, so that members of Kemp's old folks, as they would perform on the stage, would actually don the identity of certain historical American figures. So George Washington, Daniel Boone, even a Salem witch, apparently. And so costumed, they would perform these songs to collective audiences. And as Timothy Erickson says there, if I will move this on the fly, there we go. They created the idea of the New England village as the archetypal site of national identity, heritage, and collective memory. And this was enormously popular within America itself in the mid-1850s. And so Kemp decided to attempt to travel across the Atlantic and to take this stage show to London to see what British audiences would make of it. And in some senses, this was a pivotal moment because it's in 1861 that he arrives. So right at the beginning of the Civil War. An interesting moment in the transatlantic relationship because popular sentiment in London at this point was perhaps more closely allied to the Confederate South than to the New England North. But nonetheless, this was definitely a path-breaking moment for the popularity of American music in Britain. And they staged a number of concerts in the Crystal Palace and other venues in London. As you can see, there's a collection of the old folks concert tunes, which were sold to accompany the performances. And so, yeah, the London press responded to this new musical form in a whole variety of ways. The Morning Herald, Transatlantic Melody has now appeared in a perfectly new guise. The London Magnet highlighted their peculiar manner of singing, so different to the present old world style. And the London Evening Standard had it that Father Kemp's old folks had wild tunes and still wilder words. So there's a certain amount of discomfort that came along with confronting Father Kemp and the New England village that they performed here. They were popular, but not phenomenally so. And you can see as well that there were some significant reservations about the performance that Londoners were witnessing here. So for the Morning Herald, it was a pleasant evening's entertainment, but they pointed out a gentleman in a most intense and grotesque Yankee costume. For the Weekly Dispatch, really, Father Kemp, we strongly suspect that in this you are after all indulging in another New England habit. You are poking fun at us. So in some senses, there were tensions between the British imagined New England village and the nostalgically rendered and performed New England village that Father Kemp and his performers brought to London. And Father Kemp and his colleagues had to return home to America after bookings failed to cover costs. But nonetheless, this was, in some senses, the first appearance in London of an American music style harking back, which would have repercussions in decades to come. A kind of proto-folk music, if you will. I mean, folk's in the name. And if anyone knows Harry Smith's Anthology of American Folk Music, you may well recognise Father Kemp's image, which was used prominently in that recording, that release in 1952. Okay, jumping on a number of decades, but also across the American map, we have the appearance in London of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. Probably something that we have some familiarity with. But an enormous stage production, which narrativized and dramatized and popularized the American conquering of the West, with all that implies. So a kind of a stage show about manifest destiny. And when Buffalo Bill's Wild West appeared in London in 1887, it was an enormous success. So Father Kemp had a kind of niche interest in 1861, but by the time we get to the 1880s, 70s, this slice of American popular culture was an unheard of success in many ways, selling over 2 million tickets in London alone for the months that it was resident there in Earl's Court. So yeah, there's the Daily News had it in 1887. The town is already talking. A vast amount of interest has been aroused in Buffalo Bill and his remarkable company. And of course, lots has been said about the appearance of Buffalo Bill in London at this point. But I think one of the things that had less attention has been paid to is the degree to which music was a key part of the Buffalo Bill's Wild West experience, and another way in which American music helped to triangulate the relationship between Britain, America, and American imaginary in this period. So as Michael Lee Masterson has noted, just as the Wild West performance itself celebrated the frontier taming process, so in turn the cowboy band, with their ordered marches, patriotic songs, popular selections, classical overtures, and other exciting band arrangements, orally smoothened the often rough and rugged edges of folk, ragtime, Indian, and other music to make them culturally acceptable and even thrilling to the American and European audiences. So while Father Kemp's old folks were labelled wild in their music, the musical accompaniment to Buffalo Bill's Wild West show was notably unwild, was smooth in some senses, and that this was an oral equivalent to what was going on the stage show itself. But we can see that this music was used to mediate between Britain and America in this particular moment of transatlantic encounter, in a whole host of signal moments for the show. So as soon as the Wild West appeared in London in 1887, they set up camp in Earl's Court. And this is how it was described in an 1893 account of their arrival in London 1887. Upon the flagstaff, the starry banner had been run up and was floating in the breeze, and the cowboy band rendering the national airs of America amid the shouts and cheers of the thousands who lined the walls, streets, and housetops of the surrounding neighbourhood. This was most gratifying to the newcomers, and in answer to the hearty plaudits of the English, Colonel Cody ordered the band to play God Save the Queen, and the Wild West was at home in London. And we can see this use of patriotic music, both British and American, throughout these particular junction points of the Wild West tenure in London. So as you can see from the image here, Queen Victoria came for a command performance, and the cowboy band signalised Her Majesty's arrival by playing the English and American national anthems. So again, using music here to mediate between America and Britain, as represented here by their particular avatars. And yet, that narrative is slightly complicated by the response of British audiences, but also by the fact that key also to the Buffalo Bill's Wild West performance was the performance of Native Americans, and also the inclusion, therefore, of Native American music within the show itself. So what is quite a neat narrative, therefore, becomes slightly more complicated by the presence of Native American music in the show to sit alongside what Buffalo Bill's band was doing. Yes, first of all, so the cowboy band upsets all one's previous idea about the correct costume of magicians, as not magicians, that would have been fun, musicians, as one reviewer wrote. But noted they play with great spirit and with very fair execution and excellent time. But then we also have this response to Native American sounds that were made during the performance. So when all have entered, they dance and caper about in an extraordinary manner to the not particularly inspiriting sounds to English ears at all events of the tom-tom. So for that reviewer here, we use this moment to mark that kind of white supremacist viewpoint that we can notice here that Native American music is judged to be inferior here to the music being produced by Buffalo Bill's band. But at the same time, we do have another reviewer noting the way in which it's the combination of sounds that the Wild West produces, this melange of music, if you like, which actually creates that imagined America that is so key, the imagined frontier particularly, that is so key to the show. So I listen to the strange blending of orations, prayers, and the strains of the Star-Spangled Banner. So there is something in that combination of musical forms here that was actually key. Okay, jumping to my last example here, we have something that might take us into the imagined South, but is actually even more complicated in relation to ideas of race, both in Britain and in America, and in the way that race was used to triangulate both British and American identity in the 1880s. And that is what was called banjo mania, starting from the mid-1880s onwards. So here we have a story from the era in 1885. A strange rumour has got abroad that His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales, after long practice in private, has become proficient on the banjo. And we can see Bertie himself there, Edward VII, to be the Prince of Wales at this point, depicted playing the banjo, an instrument that was immediately and intimately associated with America in this period. And by 1887, we can also get the comment that the banjo, as we all know, is the favoured instrument of the aristocracy. And as David E. Chinitz has pointed out, the banjo, quote, spearheaded the Americanization of Europe, the infiltration of American popular culture into European life. Now, the men responsible for for the banjo's extraordinary appeal, particularly amongst the upper classes in Britain in the 1880s, were the Bohey brothers, James and George Bohey, who were Black American entertainers who arrived in Britain in around 1881. In fact, they were Canadian-born, but really grew up in Boston and were always labelled as American performers in Britain when they arrived in London. And we can actually see here, they had a residency at the Royal Aquarium in Great Yarmouth, so some local interest as well in our Imagined Geographies here. Yes, so there's a review from the 1882 era. The Bohey brothers sang and danced in the limelight and then played the banjo in a way that astonished all present. But key to their popular success, and as you can see for their self-advertising, was the fact that they were banjoists and entertainers to His Royal Highness, the Prince. Their Royal Highness is the Prince and Princess of Wales, and it was, according to legend, the Bohey brothers who taught Bertie how to play the banjo, and thereby created the banjo craze in Britain. And this was interpreted in a whole number of ways, and I think one of the key things about it is that Bertie's relationship with the banjo is one of the things which helped kind of define him against his mother. So, you know, Victoria was open to American musical forms, as you see, went to Buffalo Bill's Wild West and had command performances from a variety of American musicians in this period. But there's something about the banjo which was distinctive to Edward VII. So it doesn't in the least astonish us, writes one newspaper in 1887, to hear that the Prince of Wales is learning to play the banjo. The tastes of HOH have always been distinctly bohemian. So Bertie's bohemian style becomes intimately wrapped up with this American musical instrument and thereby shifts his identity and British identity with it in this period. And this was also had ramifications for the relationship between Britain and America, therefore, because as one commentator remembered in 1916, London, following the lead of the Prince of Wales, developed for the Boheys that infatuation, which is the perplexity extending to disgust of Americans. So there was something about the British embrace of the Boheys as Black American musicians who did not perform, as many black performers had to in this period, in the guise of the minstrel stage, even though their music was associated with it. They appeared as themselves, as performers without blackface, which again was a rarity in this period, even for black entertainers who were forced into that compromise to appear on the stage. And many of the Boheys songs were read as not abolitionist in this period, but songs which reflected on race in America in a way that was critiquing race relations in America. So there is this sense that it creates a kind of transatlantic fracture to some extent, the way that these American musicians are embraced, particularly by the Prince of Wales and his coterie in this period. And this leads to some interesting moments in the press as well. And actually, the Boheys used this quote on the front of their advertising material. And it's from Truth magazine in 1888, where the journalist pondered what it would feel like for an enslaved New Orleanian in this case, as he existed before the war, if he could only visit a London drawing room in full season and hear the young scions of the aristocracy twanging the once derided plantation instrument in the ears of damsels of high estate. So what does it mean for the British aristocracy to take up this instrument to some extent to kind of mask themselves as enslaved Americans? America, on the other hand, went on the attack, and we have here a picture of Bertie himself in blackface. So quite an extraordinary image from Life magazine, 1883, with an accompanying poem, which lauded it in a sense that at last we've taught the banjo to Great Britain's son and heir, though the royal dwelling's echoes are aghast at the refrain, yet the tinkle and the thrumming sound again and yet again. So many layers through the banjo of identity and imagined identity about Britishness, Americanness, and the relationship between the two in this period. When Sousa left Britain after his tour in 1901, he came to the conclusion that American music is always most welcome in Britain, and hopefully highlights, just in a whistle-stop way, how music in this period, is the examples I'm looking at, did this work of creating imagined geographies and also in mediating between different nations. So as John Connell and Chris Gibson have noted, popular music is spatial, linked to particular geographical sites, bound up in our everyday perceptions of place and a part of movements of people, products and cultures across space. And for Knights and Biddle, the nation remains a crucial but ambivalent category for understanding the ways in which music functions in the construction of personal and collective identities. And if I could just have 2 seconds more, I think, it was fascinating to watch over the summer the degree to which this was still the case, how Taylor Swift's residency in London, which had the kind of mania associated with it that we might recognise from Buffalo Bill's residencies in London or the Bohies, this was another moment in which American music was used to mediate between Britain and America, but also to shift a sense of Britishness in some senses. We have, of course, Bertie's 3 times great grandson, another Prince of Wales, paying court to an American musician at a time of regal crisis to garner some positive press. And we also had an appearance by the Starmers at Taylor Swift's concert there, conspicuously in a red dress when that photo was taken. And another at a moment which, of course, has become embroiled into a different kind of controversy. So American music is still welcome and still has lots to tell us about identity in Britain and America. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. Hello, everyone. Well, I thoroughly enjoyed listening to my colleagues. The papers are going to make for an outstandingly good collection of essays, I think, titled Infinite Space, or Good Bookshops by Christmas, I hope. And I'm very honoured to be contributing to that collection, actually. And one contribution is in a paper I've co-authored with John Wills, a great colleague from the University of Kent, who can't be here today. I think he's still finishing up another project that's been taking up his time, his Doomtown book. She got a grant to complete. Doomtown, which is about, there's a little bit of a plug for John, I hope you don't mind, a model town built to be destroyed in an atomic test blast during the Cold War. And I think after the Oppenheimer movie of the other year, it's sort of become very current, could be a big success. I said to him, it's going to be a big hit, and he's actually very sanguine about it. He says, as long as it doesn't bomb, you'll be okay. Tough crowd. Okay. All right. That's embarrassing. I'll just move on. Okay. Ah, dear. That one played a lot better at the University of Essex when I gave this paper. Anyway, there you go. All right. Okay. So, Place for New Area Studies, the Real and Imagined Landscapes of the American Frontier, which is, as I say, co-authored with John Wills. A remarkable story of real-life adventure involving Vice President-elect at the time, Theodore Roosevelt, greeted readers of the New York Times on the 19th of January, 1901. This was just weeks before his inauguration as Vice President at the time, and he'd been enjoying a hunting vacation in Colorado when, as the newspaper reported, he wandered into peril. An avid hunter, Roosevelt had been out alone that afternoon, searching for coyotes, although without luck, it was said. Then, as dusk came down, he spotted a more promising quarry. The shaggy form of a grey wolf came into view. With a hunter's instinct, the newspaper continued, Roosevelt took aim and fired as the bullet sent the beast limping and yelling over the brow of the hill. Colonel Roosevelt, he was hero of the Spanish-American War, the hero of San Juan Hill. He quickly set off in pursuit, characteristically, without thought of danger. It was only then that he noticed the yelping of the wounded animal was answered by others. and as a chorus of howls went up, resounding across the landscape, the country soon echoed, seemed alive with wolves. Grimly outnumbered, Roosevelt lost his bearings as darkness began to fall. The hunter had become the hunted. As the beast closed in, the colonel beat a retreat, climbing a nearby tree. But as he made his ascent a calamity, his cartridge belt was dislodged and fell. So as he took his position a branch, only 2 revolvers to hand, he was besieged by wolves at the bottom of the tree. It was 4 hours later, near midnight, by the time the search party arrived. The New York Times described the scene to its readers as the rescuers arrived, the hunting dogs scattering the wolves. The grisly scene was revealed. Half a dozen wolves lay dead at the foot of the tree, claimed by Roosevelt's revolvers. So for the Metropolitan, this is rather good actually. Should I just stop there? It's a rather good story. For the Metropolitan readers of the New York Times, the report of Theodore Roosevelt's scrape with wolves in Colorado in 1901 undoubtedly offered a moment of light relief. You can imagine reading that over a kind of morning cup of coffee and eggs, or maybe on the streetcar off to work. A moment of light relief, excitement, adventure. And it was as though Vice President-elect had stepped out of his hunting vacation and into the sort of frontier adventure more typically found in a dime novel. The United States had long since turned the page on the days of the frontier, of course. It had vanished, as Roosevelt himself wrote in his 1893 book, The Wilderness Hunter. He wrote, as the tongues of settlement reached out from the Mississippi to the Rocky Mountains, and from the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific, the frontier had vanished. But it still held an enduring fascination, becoming woven into national mythology, as writers famously like Richard Slotkin have documented. Even before his hair's breadth adventure in Colorado, in fact, Roosevelt himself had contributed to the making of frontier mythology with his multi-volume, heavily romanticized history, if you can call it that, The Winning of the West, between 1889 and 1896, that was published. And others in his social circle did likewise, great mythologizers of the West, like Owen Wister, author of The Virginian. Note to self, don't speak while drinking out of a bottle. Okay, as Christine Bold has explained, this sort of writing helped shape a sort of Western genre of fiction that's been handed down through many generations since, from the turn of the 20th century. At the same time, though, the idea of the frontier found its way to other genres of writing as well. So also into recreational pastimes and entertainments. So expressions of frontier fantasy are really the subject of the chapter that John and I are contributing to this volume. Well, hopefully, I mean, let's see how I do after this. You might pull it, I guess. I hope not. I should consider it an audition. So the chapter suggests that the frontier as a fantasy landscape was, though, more than an imagined staging for American storytelling. This was a way, we approached this as a way of inscribing meaning upon the landscape, an actual landscape, investing it with a sense of discovery, even though it had long been populated and then discovered, so to speak, by European settlers, investing it with a sense of discovery, wonder, and enchantment, or adventure, or at times expressing nostalgia. Long after it vanished, as it were, the frontier continued to influence the way Americans imagined their country, their immediate environment, and crucially also the meaning of place. And this has, we would suggest, important implications for new area studies. So, Susan, if, as you have suggested, so it's lovely to have you in the room, actually. If you've, well, I hope you don't correct me from the floor. There's always questions. Let's hold that for questions. If Susan has suggested, the pioneers of new area studies have often gone in search of the grounded reality of place to find out, as it were, a lovely quote, what it feels like to be there, which is read that as like a gift to me. Thank you very much. Then what follows, I think, in this chapter is rather a question of what it's like to imagine oneself to be there. While Close and Bromberg have, in a more grounded sense, attended to the particular communities in which people live their lives and the places to which they perceive themselves as belonging, nice quote, the discussion here deals with escapist fantasies that shape ideas of place. And we quite like to bring those into dialogue with the work that's already been done in new area studies about place making. To put it another way, in grappling with the frontier, we're dealing with an area that existed partly in the physical world and partly in what I'll reach for the author J.G. Ballard called, just because I like this concept, what J.G. Ballard called the inner space of imagination, which is the domain of fantasy. So in making sense of this, we've drawn on some other thinkers. John Urry, concept of the tourist gaze, which is an important part of the making of these frontier fantasies. What he defined as a way of regarding a set of different scenes of landscapes or townscapes which are out of the ordinary. The related tourist gaze considered here was likewise a product of daydreaming and fantasies sustained by books and magazines and other media to encourage contemplation of pleasures imagined to lie outside the bounds of everyday life. It can, in this way, existing both in the real world and in the realm of fantasy, it can be perhaps understood in terms that the geographer Edward Soja conceived as third space. Third space is a place that is both real and imagined at the same time. When we are in a place, we imagine we are somewhere else, or we may be somewhere imagining ourselves somewhere else. Rather, Sarah, as you were talking about in relation to clothes and the decisions that one makes, perhaps transporting oneself. In fact, well, I won't get ahead of myself. So this is to say the frontier acquired definition as a place when real locations became the stage for fantasies, blurring the borders of time and space, reality and imagination, in the cultural production of an area and a place. So inhabiting the imagination as much as reality, the frontier is rather eminently suitable for this. And I think in the chapter, one thing we want to do is maybe establish a way of understanding the frontier as separate from the West as such. A lot of work's been done since the 80s, the new Western historians, to establish and outline the social history of the West, which can be geographically pinned down, actually. Let's say west of the 100th meridian, typically, or west of the Mississippi River. That's a geographical place. But the frontier is almost like a state of mind, or a place in mind, or a place in imagination. As the early theorist or historian of the frontier, Frederick Jackson Turner, wrote, the oldest West was the Atlantic coast. So just to say, it's a kind of settlement of North America. Turner, not really someone we'd look to today to interpret and understand the history of the West, but kind of useful to indicate the ways in which the colonization of North America was as much a sort of shifting line, a way of relating to the landscape rather than identifying a particular geographical place. So I suppose I better start to finish up. I think I'm getting near the end of time. So I'll just indicate a couple of examples that we worked through in the chapter. So number one would be looking at Yellowstone National Park. And this is a rather lovely brochure for the railway company, which was at the time proposing to take tourists off to Yellowstone National Park. So as the tourist industry developed, the railroads played an important part in promoting that commerce. Yellowstone National Park, it was an area, right, the part of a landscape that was sort of given definition, turned into a national park, delimited and given a border. More importantly, even from the early 1870s, it was referred to as Wonderland, admired for its fantastical geographical and geological phenomenon. It's sort of spouting geysers and plunging waterfalls. And this idea of a wonderland came to define an understanding of Yellowstone National Park, and people would visit Yellowstone and they would sort of self-consciously be arriving in a place that they were conceiving as a wonderland, a place apart, a place of wonder and enchantment. And rather nicely, this brochure kind of played a part in popularizing this, I guess. A little brochure that tells the story of Lewis Carroll's Alice in the New Wonderland of Yellowstone. So a place that is a sort of real landscape that comes, it gains definition in American culture through the process of imagination. Or to sort of slightly switch tack, we might think about outdoor sports catalogues, how they promote sales of firearms, but also importantly outdoor clothing as well. And here's a picture of a catalogue. The colour is really vivid here on the screen, but the catalogue itself has a cover rather like an outdoor sports magazine, like Outdoor Life or Field and Stream, or even a sort of popular Western novel here. Which is to say that the items that you buy from Abercrombie and Fitch, which later became a kind of mid-range fashion retailer, right? But back in the day was an outdoor sports retailer. The items that you buy from that can, you might buy a rather nice sort of hunting jacket and then go for a walk in the park, and suddenly the park becomes this sort of like frontier like environment. So in a sense, we sort of worked through an interpretation of this to arrive at this point that I suppose the frontier is anywhere you choose to see it, or perhaps you can build the frontier itself. And we finish up with a rather wonderful place, Knott's Berry Farm in California, and a sort of synthetic West that's created here, a place for adventure for tourists. But I think probably, Rachel, I should probably finish up before I get the old billhook, shouldn't I? But I suppose in a sense this we see as a development that is really, I suppose, inspired by that work in new area studies, especially Susan. You know, so in a sense, the whole chapter develops out of that quote that I mentioned from you, and trying to think, as I say, about place as sort of a hybrid zone between, as I say, reality and imagination. That's probably enough from me, so I'll go and sit down. Thank you very much for listening.
In particular, I do think all the papers are asking everyone to think about where we find ourselves, and more actively where we make American area studies on the inside, I guess, which is a really lovely way of thinking about the activity that we're doing, and that includes everyone in the know that's why we're here. So it's a really great start to this evening. But yeah, it's time for any questions, comments, anyone, anything you want to start us off with?
Really interesting papers. Thank you very much. And I was struck by how the first two papers were really, I want to ask about gender and place. Because the first two papers by two women were very much focused on sort of women's efforts to push us to imagine place in different ways. Very interesting. And the last two by men were very much about sort of male musicians. There was a bit with Taylor Swift at the end, and then there was a very small tourist, just a advertisement, I guess, showing a female tourist looking at Yellowstone Park. which is all okay, right? But I want you to push whoever wants to think about relating gender, whether it's gender and frontier, gender, and there were a couple of crossover moments where I wondered whether the HHH, those robes were hiding some female bodies, which they seem to be, which was interesting. But when we think of frontier and exploration, it's been sort of established in the literature, it's heavily masculine in both feature and film. So I'm just throwing that out there if anybody has any responses.
Happy to start off. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Oh gosh.
Still have
Yeah, that's helpful for people. It is on, yeah. Yeah, is it having any effect? Okay, I'll keep going. Yes, you're absolutely right. There are women in the robes, and that's partly because the little anecdote I told that Foley was inspired to think about gender in terms of, I guess, her encounter with the idea that there were female clanswomen. One of the things I asked her about was, because she speaks in another context about when she asks young white Australian men to play roles in some of her site-based photography work in Australia, they're very uncomfortable playing the racist role. And she's kind of talked about no one wants to be the racist guy. So I said, well, how did it feel to be in those robes? Was there an ambivalence? Because I see a real ambivalence in these images, which I think is captured by those words that she uses. And she said, certainly no, she and I think there were two other women in the robes, found it very empowering, and they went to the fabric shop, they chose the fabrics that they wanted their robes to be. So there is, I think, I don't know, I haven't really got much further than thinking about the way the HHH images turn on their heads most of Foley's other work in relation to Black femininity, which is to do with the way Aboriginal women were sexualised in Australia. So she's got another series called Black Velvet, which, as the name suggests, looks at the sexualisation, the historical sexualisation and exploitation of Black women. So for her, this is very much a more straightforward kind of turning of power on its, against itself, I think, in the HHH images. But yeah, I don't know if Dan, you wanted to speak to that, or if I'm supposed to pass to someone else about.
Oh, sure, yeah. When you do buy a copy of Infinite Space, when it's published, I hope you'll read the chapter in full. And I think if I'd had a bit more time, I would have been able to address this, because I think actually it's really important to underline that when let's go back to the Abercrombie and Fitch section there. So Abercrombie and Fitch sold sporting goods and clothes for men and for women, and specifically clothes designed for sportswomen by the 1920s, certainly. But even before then, the 1900s, more and more women were buying specialist, specially designed women's and marketed women's sports clothes, because women were increasingly going out off into the Borison Mountains, sometimes with chaperones and brothers or husbands. It was very common for couples to go off to get together, actually, and a lot of outdoor sports writing at the time presumed that readers would take sisters or wives. They were written largely for men, those books, addressed to men, but I think the understanding was that they'd be written read both by men and by women. There were increasing numbers of women sports writers at the time, and I think this was a culture that was becoming kind of increasingly democratized, both in terms of class, so more middle class people were able to take part and were reading and filling their heads with these dreams, but also women were increasingly part of that culture too. So yeah, absolutely.
That's historical fact, but we're talking about myth and imagined geography, and men have it that Imagined Geographies.
But I suppose that would be one point that we could make, is that I guess women are also part of that process of imagining the this kind of wild, great outdoors at this time, which is perhaps, when you look at the history from this angle, it actually does provide a slightly surprising angle, because maybe what you're referring to is, I guess, there's a great weight of scholarship, excellent scholarship, that has looked at similar questions before, and often through the lens of Theodore Roosevelt's experience and his cronies, very heavily masculinized, very kind of macho outdoorsy image. And I think today maybe even there's a certain current in American outdoor sports that is kind of a bit manly and macho, although there are competing alternatives as well. Probably enough for me. I get another second paper out of that. Thanks for the question.
Dan, do you need a mic, or are you?
I don't think so. Thanks just such a benefits to the folks at home. Shall I?
Oh, we do.
Yeah.
Thanks. We do need a mic. It's like...
Thanks everybody for the excellent panel. My questions, I think, are mainly for Sarah, but I suppose could be taken up by others as well. Just two short questions, if I may. When you refer to American pragmatism and its mythology, are you referring to the mythology of American pragmatism, or like in relation to how a philosophy can be kind of nationalized and then mythologized around its national use or significance? Or are you talking about other kinds of mythologies around pragmatism per se? That's the first question. Second question is, I suppose, linked to philosophy as well, which is to think about how somebody like Roland Barthes, for example, may have explored the relationship between clothing and its language. So how in these feelings, in these atmospheres, also arises, as you were saying, for narrative, for speaking, for discourse and dialogue, testimony and all this. But to then take that kind of one step further to think about, okay, so if it does matter that these things can be put into language, or kind of which language, how does that language that we use, whether through our subtle speech or our articulated speech, also then count when it comes to the atmospheres under consideration?
Yes, that's two big questions. We're over. So can I be brief with the first one and attempt to be brief with the second one as well? But so that the first one, the reason why pragmatism is popping up there is because the chapter that I've written on the evolution of American casual wear actually begins to draw this line between the American pragmatist tradition through Dewey and James, and that sense of this being a country that identifies itself with action, with doing, with almost sort of thought and action on the spot, becomes identified with this figure of the American middle class housewife through people like Claire McCardell and the popover dress and the slip over dress, and that sense that sort of what it meant at the birth of casual wear, where it comes into intersection with this campus wear and this sportswear, becomes this way of actually embodying and enacting those similar mythologies of can-doism that you actually see in people like Dewey and James. Yeah. The complexity arises actually when there's a lot more in Dewey and James that I actually find very useful, and I find very useful as someone thinking about experience and area and how one might use scholarship to act in the world. So Dewey and James go on a bit of a longer journey here, and actually one of those journeys the chapter tries to make is takes in what Cornell West does, critiquing them, which says actually this idea of activity and experience in an American context is this really problematic echo of the frontier. So what do you do with this idea that in some places is useful and other places brings along these cultural layers, which are, I think problematic is not the word, right? This is, you want something bigger than that. So
that's why the chapter ends up so long. It goes from Claire McKeldale's popover dress through Dewey and James and Cornell West and out the other end to climate justice. So this is what you can do in area studies. So that's my short answer. My shortish answer is to the second one about dress and language, is that part of what I'm trying to do is finesse this question about how much of our personal activity can be thought of as signification and how much of it is actually a bit more ambient, a bit more sub-semiotic, is a bit more to do with phenomenological activity in a room, with respecting materials, respecting even what like the weight of wearing something might mean, as well as the weight of wearing symbols. Part of my issue with Bart, and I love Bart in most contexts, but the clothing is not just a symbol, and some of the most smart work on it actually takes apart the idea of dress and communication and says, okay, so if you have a communication, you generally have a clear thing you're communicating, you have a shared language between sender and receiver, you have a clear sense of perhaps how it lands and it's not meant to do. But actually, if you are a person who might not necessarily find it easy to get dressed in the morning, none of those processes, none of those points are working properly. So if dress, and Fred Davis does this in Identity and Dress, Malcolm Bernard does it in Dress and Communication, that metaphor as we send a signal about our identity doesn't work, and it doesn't fully work, and it doesn't fully work in place, and it completely jettisons the material that we're using to do this, which might actually be speaking on our behalf, might be saying something, if you use the linguistic metaphor, that we don't even want it to say. So there's lots of smart work that kicks back against the idea of dress as communication, but I don't think it's one we can lose entirely. So this is where atmosphere begins to me to be a little bit more interesting, in that we get a little less solipsistic, a little less identity-led. Part of the worry about dress and communication is often based in the study of perhaps a 21-year-old wishing to say something to a group of people who may or may not be listening. Whereas if you bring in the more recent stuff like Julia Twigg's work on the dressing of dementia sufferers in homes, there's actually a lot more going on than that. It's that sending and receiving model is part of it, almost like a gladiatorial model that doesn't quite work. And of course, we do have to figure gender into all of it. So part of what I'm trying to work out is, how do we valorize and pay attention to the small, whilst actually realizing that this complex moment, this moment that I've started off with descriptions and descriptions at the wardrobe, might actually be diverting mental energy from doing something else, right? There's a gendered moment we have to pay attention to, but actually there's an energy cost to that as well. You know, so how do we factor in pleasure and aesthetics and importance and weigh it against that sense of where smallness begins to hurt us, where smallness does begin to gender? That's a good, so there's more questions, but I think I'm going to be quiet now. We are way over time. Sorry, I felt way over time.
It's probably quite a good area to stick to time, so I'm wondering whether I can stop at this point at break. I just want to thank you all for attending and for really good questions and for our people.